They ordered him to shoot her, and instead he lowered his gun, and in that quiet moment under a sky bleached white by the desert sun, something shifted that no war had ever managed to break, the wind dragging slow ribbons of dust across the hard ground as Ethan Cole stood there with his boots planted firm, his fingers still wrapped around the grip he did not use, his breath shallow, measured, like a man who had learned that sometimes the loudest thing you could do was nothing at all, and across. From him she did not move either, the Apache girl with eyes darker than the storm clouds that rolled in once a year over these dry miles, her shoulders squared though her strength was fading, the torn edge of her sleeve fluttering against her arm like a warning he did not yet understand, and somewhere far behind him a voice carried over the open land, sharp and certain, calling his name with the authority of command, reminding him of who he was supposed to be, a soldier, a man who followed orders, a man who did not hesitate, but hesitation had already taken root inside him, quiet as a seed beneath the dust, and it would not be pulled free so easily, not after what he had seen, not after the long miles of silence that had followed every order he had ever obeyed without question, and now the desert seemed to hold its breath with him, the heat pressing down like a hand, the distant cry of a hawk circling above drawing a thin line between sky and earth, and she watched him as if measuring something deeper than his stance, deeper than the weapon he carried, as if she could see the weight he held that no one else ever noticed, and when she finally spoke her voice came low, steady, each word placed carefully like stones across a river, "Your kind does not stop," and he did not answer right away, because there were too many answers and none of them felt true enough to survive the space between them, so he let the silence stretch instead, long enough for the wind to shift direction, long enough for the sun to dip just enough to cast a sharper shadow at his feet, and then he did something that would have made no sense to the men behind him, something that would echo long after this moment had passed. He stepped forward one pace, just one, closing the distance not as a threat but as a choice, and in that single step there was a story neither of them had told yet, a story of miles walked alone, of nights where the only sound was the creak of leather and the distant howl of something unseen, of memories that did not fade no matter how far you rode. And she did not step back, though her hand tightened slightly at her side, ready if she had to be, always ready, because out here survival did not wait for trust to grow, and still her eyes did not leave his, searching, questioning, refusing to believe without proof, and behind him the sound of hooves grew louder now, steady, approaching, men who would not pause the way he had, men who would see only one thing when they looked at her, and Ethan knew that whatever happened next would not be undone, not by words, not by reason, because out here decisions did not fade, they carved themselves into the land like tracks that never quite disappeared, and he felt that truth settle in his chest as heavy as the canteen at his side, the leather strap worn from years of use, a small thing that had kept him alive more times than he could count, and without looking away from her he reached for it, slow enough that she could stop him if she chose, careful enough that even the wind seemed to watch, and when he held it out the metal caught the light for just a second. A quiet signal in a place where nothing was ever truly silent, and she stared at it, then at him, the space between suspicion and something else stretching thin as a thread, and somewhere in that fragile space a different kind of story began to take shape, one not written by orders or borders or the lines men drew across maps they barely understood, but by something harder to name, something that did not shout or demand, something that simply waited, patient as the desert itself, for someone brave enough to choose it. And as the riders closed the last stretch of distance and the dust rose behind them like a curtain, Ethan Cole did not raise his gun again, not this time, not when it mattered most, and that was where everything truly began. The riders came in slow, not because they were cautious, but because they believed there was nothing here that could challenge them, their horses cutting steady lines through the dust as the sound of hooves rolled across the open land like distant thunder, and Ethan did not turn to face them, not yet, because the only thing that mattered in that moment stood 10 feet in front of him, watching, waiting, measuring every breath he took as if the truth of him could be found somewhere between the rise and fall of his chest, and when the first horse stopped behind him the leather creaked under the shift of weight, a familiar sound, one that had followed him through years of service, and a voice followed, calm but edged with something sharper underneath. "Cole," it said, not loud, not rushed, just certain, the kind of voice that expected to be obeyed without question, and Ethan closed his eyes for half a second, just long enough to feel the heat against his skin, long enough to remember the difference between who he had been and who he was about to become, and when he opened them again he still did not raise his weapon, he did not step aside, he did not explain, he simply stood there, and that silence unsettled them more than any argument could have, because men who followed orders understood defiance best when it was loud, when it gave them something to push against, but this quiet refusal, gave them nothing. And the second rider shifted in the saddle, the faint jingle of metal breaking the stillness as another voice joined in, less patient, more certain of itself. "That is her," he said, and Ethan could feel their eyes move past him, settling on the girl, reducing her to something simple, something defined, something that did not require understanding, and still she did not move, her gaze never leaving Ethan, as if the riders behind him were nothing more than a passing storm. And that alone told him more than words ever could, because fear would have looked different, fear would have scattered her, but this was something else, something rooted deeper than survival. And Ethan found himself speaking before he had fully decided to, his voice low, steady, carrying just enough to reach them without breaking the fragile line between him and her. "She is not what you think," he said, and the words hung there, thin and dangerous, because out here truth was not something people agreed on, it was something they chose, and the first rider let out a slow breath, the sound almost a laugh but not quite. "It does not matter what we think," he replied, "it matters what we were sent to do," and there it was, simple, clean, the kind of certainty that made men dangerous, because it left no room for doubt, no space for hesitation, and Ethan felt the weight of that certainty press against him like the heat of the sun, familiar, suffocating, something he had lived under for too long, and for a moment the past tried to pull him back, tried to remind him how easy it was to step aside, to let the world move the way it always had, to let orders carry the burden so he did not have to. But then the wind shifted again, carrying the faint scent of dry sage across the distance, and something in that quiet, something in the way she stood without asking for anything, without pleading, without turning away, made that old path feel smaller than it ever had before, and Ethan shook his head once, not sharply, not dramatically, just enough to make it clear that whatever came next would not follow the lines they expected, and behind him a saddle shifted again. Impatience growing now, a different kind of tension building, one that had nothing to do with the girl and everything to do with him, because a man who hesitated could be corrected, but a man who chose not to obey, that was something else entirely, and the first rider leaned forward slightly, his shadow stretching long across the ground until it touched Ethan's boots. "Step aside," he said, and there was no anger in it, no threat, just the weight of inevitability, the assumption that this would end the way it always did, that Ethan would remember his place and move, and for a moment the world narrowed to that single space between command and choice, the air thick, unmoving, the horizon stretching wide and indifferent to whatever men decided within it, and Ethan glanced down at the canteen still in his hand, the metal warm now from the sun, and then back at her, and without a word he took another step forward, placing himself fully between her and the riders, not as a shield, not as a gesture, but as a decision that could not be taken back, and that was when the silence changed, not broken, but altered, as if the land itself had shifted its weight to watch what would come next, and somewhere far off a hawk cried again, circling above a moment that none of them would forget, not because of what was done, but because of what was chosen, and for the first time since the riders arrived, the man behind Ethan did not speak right away, because even he could feel it now, that something had moved beyond orders, beyond lines drawn on maps, into a place where the next step would not be decided by rank or duty, but by something far harder to control, something that did not answer to any command at all. The man behind Ethan finally exhaled, slow and deliberate, as if weighing something heavier than the order itself, and when he spoke again his voice had changed, not louder, not harsher, but tighter, like a rope pulled 1 inch too far. "You are standing in the wrong place, Cole," he said, and the words carried a warning wrapped in something that almost sounded like concern. Because out here a man could make one mistake and spend the rest of his life chasing its shadow, and Ethan heard it. Understood it, felt the truth of it settle somewhere deep, but he did not move, not even when the horses shifted again behind him, restless now, sensing the tension that men tried to hide, and the girl watched all of it with that same steady gaze, as if she had seen this moment before in 100 different forms, as if men arguing over what was right and what was ordered was nothing new under this sky, and maybe it was not. Maybe this land had heard the same conversation long before any of them were born, carried on the wind and buried in the dust, waiting for someone to listen differently, and Ethan found himself speaking again, quieter this time, not for the riders, not even fully for her, but for something in between, something that needed to be said even if no one accepted it. There is no wrong place, he said, only what a man chooses to stand for, and the silence that followed was not empty, it was full, stretched tight with everything left unsaid, and one of the younger riders shifted in his saddle, uncertain now, his confidence slipping just enough to be noticed, because certainty depended on everyone moving the same way, and Ethan had broken that rhythm, just by staying still, and the first rider looked past him again, studying the girl with a sharper eye now, as if trying to understand why this moment had taken a turn he had not expected, and she did not lower her gaze, did not soften, did not ask for anything, and that unsettled him more than defiance would have, because defiance could be answered, but quiet strength left no easy path forward, and Ethan felt that shift ripple outward, subtle but real, like the first sign of a storm that might never fully arrive, and he realized then that this was not about convincing them, not about explaining, because men who followed orders did not change their minds with words, they changed when something inside them no longer fit the shape they had been given, and that kind of change did not happen all at once, it started small, almost invisible, and he wondered, just for a moment, if any of them felt it now, or if he was the only one standing on that edge, and behind him. The first rider finally dismounted, boots hitting the ground with a soft thud that carried farther than it should have in the still air, and he stepped forward, slow, measured, until he stood just a few feet away, close enough that Ethan could see the lines around his eyes, the years carved there by choices that had not always been his own, and for a second neither of them spoke. The space between them filled with everything they had been taught and everything they had learned the hard way, and then the man glanced at the canteen in Ethan's hand, at the way it was still offered, still extended, not as a challenge, not as a bargain, but as something simple, something human, and that seemed to trouble him more than anything else, because it did not belong here, not in a place defined by sides and lines and orders, and he shook his head slightly, almost to himself, before looking back up. You think this changes anything, he said, and it was not a question, not really, it was a statement dressed like one, and Ethan did not answer right away, because the truth was not something he could explain in a single sentence. It was something he had only just begun to understand, something that had been building long before this moment, and finally he spoke, his voice steady, not loud, not defensive, just certain in a way he had never been before. It changes me, he said, and that was all, no more, no less, and for a second the man in front of him simply stared, as if trying to measure that answer against everything he believed, everything he had lived by, and behind them the wind picked up again, lifting the dust in slow spirals that blurred the edges of the world, softening the lines that men tried so hard to keep sharp, and the girl took a single step forward then, not toward the riders, not away from them, but closer to Ethan, close enough that he could feel her presence without turning, and that small movement carried more weight than any word spoken so far, because it was a choice, quiet and deliberate, just like his, and in that shared silence something passed between them that did not need to be named. Something that did not belong to either side, and for the first time since the riders arrived, the man in front of Ethan hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to show that even out here, even under orders and expectation and years of habit, a single moment of stillness could change the direction of everything that followed, and no one moved after that, not right away, because they all felt it now, that something unseen had shifted. And whatever came next would not be decided the way it always had before. No one gave the order to move, and that was what made the moment heavier than any command ever could, the kind of weight that settled into the bones and refused to leave, and Ethan could feel it in the way the air seemed thicker, harder to breathe, as if the desert itself had decided to listen, and the man in front of him shifted his stance just slightly, not forward, not back, just enough to show that even certainty had its limits, and behind them one of the horses let out a low breath, the sound soft but sharp in the stillness, reminding them all that time had not stopped, that choices could not hang suspended forever, and Ethan tightened his grip on the canteen for a second before easing it again, aware now that the smallest movement carried meaning, that even the way he stood was being read, weighed, judged, and he did not try to change it, did not try to appear stronger or calmer than he was, because whatever came next would not be decided by how he looked, but by whether he stayed, and he had already chosen that, and beside him, just within reach, the girl finally moved her hand, not toward him, not toward the riders, but to the small leather cord at her neck, her fingers brushing against it as if grounding herself, and Ethan caught the glint of something there, a small piece of stone wrapped in worn thread, nothing valuable by the standards of men who counted worth in land and cattle, but it carried weight, the kind that did not show itself unless you knew where to look, and something about it stirred a memory he had not expected, something distant and quiet, like a voice heard long ago and nearly forgotten, and before he could place it, the man in front of him spoke again, slower this time, each word measured. "You are making this harder than it needs to be," he said, and there was no accusation in it, only a kind of tired truth, the kind that came from years of seeing the same patterns play out, the same endings written before they began, and Ethan almost understood him, almost saw the path he was offering, the simple step back, the return to order, the closing of this moment like it had never opened, but then the wind shifted again, carrying that same dry scent across the distance, and he remembered something else instead. Something his father had once told him on a long ride home when the sun was setting and the world felt quieter than usual, that a man was not measured by the battles he followed, but by the ones he chose not to fight, and at the time it had sounded like nothing more than words, something to fill the silence, but now it settled into place with a clarity that made everything else seem smaller, and Ethan lifted his head slightly, meeting the other man's gaze without challenge, without apology, just steady. And that alone was enough to draw a line that had not been there before, and for a moment no one spoke again, because they all understood now that this was no longer about the girl, no longer about the order, it was about him, about whether one man could stand against the shape of things that had always been, and the answer to that question was not something anyone could predict, not even Ethan himself, and then, from somewhere beyond the low ridge to the east, a sound carried across the land, faint at first, almost mistaken for the wind, but steady, rhythmic, unmistakable once it reached them, the distant beat of hooves, not hurried, not scattered, but moving together with a purpose that did not need to announce itself, and every head turned slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge it, because out here you learned to listen before you looked, and the man in front of Ethan felt it too, that subtle shift, that new presence entering a moment already stretched thin, and his eyes flicked toward the horizon for a brief second before returning, sharper now, more alert, and the younger rider behind them straightened in the saddle, uncertainty tightening into something closer to tension, because this was not part of the plan, this was not written into the orders they had followed across miles of open land, and Ethan did not turn at all, not even when the sound grew clearer, closer, because he did not need to see it to understand what it meant, he felt it in the way the girl beside him stilled, not with fear, but with recognition, a quiet certainty that settled over her like a shadow at dusk, and she did not look back either, did not break the line between her and Ethan, and that told him everything he needed to know, and the man in front of him saw it too, saw the shift in her, saw the way the moment had expanded beyond his control, and for the first time since this began, he hesitated without hiding it, his jaw tightening just slightly as he considered what came next, because whatever approached from that ridge was not his to command, not his to direct, and that changed things in a way no argument ever could, and Ethan felt the air move again, cooler now, carrying the promise of something larger than any one decision, and he realized then that standing here had never been about stopping anything, it had been about holding the line long enough for something else to arrive, something that did not belong to him or to the men behind him, and as the sound of hooves drew closer, steady and unhurried, the world seemed to narrow and widen at the same time, pulling all of them into a moment that would not be forgotten, not because of what might happen, but because of what had already been chosen. And Ethan did not move, not now, not when it mattered most. Because some things, once decided, did not need to be spoken again. The sound of hooves crested the ridge at last, not rushing, not scattered, but moving with a quiet unity that carried across the land like a low drumbeat, steady and certain, and as the first figures appeared against the pale sky, outlined in dust and light, no one spoke, because there was nothing left to say that could shape what was already unfolding, and Ethan felt the shift settle deeper, not as tension now, but as something heavier, something final, like the closing of a door he had once believed would always remain open, and the man in front of him turned fully this time, his attention no longer fixed on Ethan alone but drawn to what approached, his posture tightening just enough to reveal that even he understood the line had moved beyond his reach, and the riders came into view one by one, their forms clear now, their pace unbroken, not a charge, not a threat, but a presence that did not need to prove itself, and the dust curled around their horses' legs as if the land itself recognized them, and Ethan did not count them, did not measure their number, because it was not their size that mattered, it was the way they carried themselves, the quiet certainty that did not ask permission, and beside him the girl let out a breath so soft it barely reached the air, but he felt it, a release, a recognition, and when she finally stepped forward again it was not toward him this time, not toward the riders behind, but toward the approaching line, slow, deliberate, each step placed with the same quiet strength she had held since the beginning, and Ethan watched her go without reaching out, without stopping her. Because some paths were not meant to be shared beyond a certain point, and he understood that now in a way he had not before, and the man behind him said nothing, did nothing, because whatever authority he had carried into this moment had already been left somewhere behind, lost in the space between command and choice, and as the riders drew closer, their faces still shadowed by distance, the wind shifted once more, carrying the faint sound of leather, of breath, of something older than any order given on paper, and the girl reached up again, her fingers brushing the small stone at her neck, and this time Ethan saw it clearly, the worn edges, the familiar shape, and the memory that had lingered just out of reach finally settled into place, a quiet echo from years past, a story his mother had told in a voice softer than the world around it, about a time when she had been lost, when strangers had chosen not to turn away, when something small had been given that meant more than anything she could name, and he felt that memory settle into his chest like a weight that did not press down, but held steady, and for a moment he wondered if this was what she had meant, if this was what it looked like when a debt found its way back across time and distance, not with words, not with declarations, but with a simple choice to stand, and the riders slowed as they neared, not because they were uncertain, but because there was no need to rush what had already been decided, and the girl stopped a few feet ahead of Ethan, turning just slightly, enough that he could see her profile against the light, and for the first time since he had met her, her expression softened, not into a smile, not into anything easily named, but into something quieter, something that carried understanding without needing to speak it, and she gave the smallest nod, so slight it could have been missed by anyone not watching closely, but Ethan saw it, felt it, and in that single movement there was more meaning than any words they could have shared, and he did not nod back, did not respond, because he knew this was not something that required an answer. It was something to be accepted, and as the riders came to a stop, forming a silent line across the open ground, the space between all of them filled with a stillness that felt almost sacred, as if the land itself had drawn a breath and chosen to hold it, and Ethan stood where he was, no longer between two sides, no longer defined by the line he had crossed, but simply as a man who had chosen to stay, and for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. No one moved to greet them, and no one reached for anything that might turn the moment into something it was not, because what had arrived did not need introduction, it carried its own meaning in the way the riders sat tall and still, in the way their eyes moved across the land without hurry, taking in everything and revealing nothing, and the man who had stood before Ethan a moment ago stepped back half a pace without realizing he had done it, his authority thinning not from fear but from the quiet understanding that he no longer held the center of this moment, and Ethan felt that shift like a change in the wind, subtle but undeniable, and he lowered the canteen at last, not as surrender, not as retreat, but because its purpose had already been fulfilled, the offer made, the choice taken, and there was nothing left to prove through it, and the girl stood a few feet ahead now, her posture straight, her chin lifted just enough to meet the gaze of the riders who had come for her, and when the lead rider finally dismounted, his boots touched the ground with a softness that spoke of long miles and steady hands, and he did not rush forward, did not speak right away, he simply stood there, looking at her first, then at Ethan, and something passed between those two glances that Ethan could not fully read but could feel all the same, a quiet measure, a weighing of something that did not belong to words, and the wind moved again, brushing across the dry earth, carrying the faint scent of leather and sun-warmed dust, and the lead rider's eyes settled on the small stone at the girl's neck, and for a brief moment the lines of his face softened, not into a smile, but into recognition, and that was when Ethan understood that whatever Story had brought them here had begun long before he stepped into it, that he was not the cause but only a part of something already in motion, and the man behind him shifted again, uncertain now, caught between the habits he knew and the silence he did not, and no order came from him, no command to restore the shape of things, because there was no clear path left to take, and the girl spoke then, her voice low, steady, carrying across the small space between them and the riders, and though Ethan did not understand the words, he understood the tone, the calm within it, the absence of fear, and the lead rider listened without interruption, his gaze never leaving her, and when she finished, he nodded once, slow and deliberate, the same kind of nod she had given Ethan just moments before, and that echo was not lost on him, and then the man turned his attention fully to Ethan, not with challenge, not with accusation, but with something closer to acknowledgement, and for a long second. Neither of them spoke, because there was nothing simple enough to say, and finally the rider inclined his head just slightly, not a bow, not submission, but a gesture that carried weight in its restraint, and Ethan did not return it, not because he refused, but because he understood that this was not a transaction, not something to be matched or mirrored, it was something to be received, and he stood there as he had from the beginning, steady, silent, letting the moment pass through him without trying to shape it, and behind him the soldiers remained where they were, no longer pressing forward, no longer certain of their place in what was unfolding, and the distance between the two sides felt different now, not like a line drawn in the dirt, but like a space that could exist without needing to be crossed, and the lead rider stepped back then, turning slightly toward the others, and with that simple movement the tension that had held everything together began to loosen, not break, but ease, like a knot that no longer needed to be pulled tight, and the girl turned as well, not fully away from Ethan, but enough to begin moving toward her people, and as she passed him she did not stop. Did not speak, but her shoulder brushed the edge of his arm, light as wind, and in that brief contact there was a finality that words could not carry, and Ethan watched her go without following, without calling out, because he understood now that some bonds were not meant to hold people in place, they were meant to show them where to stand, and as the riders began to turn, their horses shifting beneath them, the land seemed to exhale, the weight lifting just enough to remind him that it had been there all along, and the man who had given the orders earlier said nothing at all, because there was nothing left that could return this moment to what it had been, and Ethan remained where he was, the dust settling slowly around his boots, the sun lowering inch by inch across the sky, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, the silence around him did not feel empty, it felt earned. The riders did not rush away, and that was what lingered longest after the moment had passed, the way they turned slow, deliberate, as if each movement carried weight beyond the simple act of leaving, and the dust rose gently beneath their horses, not as a cloud of departure but as a quiet veil that softened the edges of what had just unfolded, and Ethan stood where he was, watching without staring, letting the scene settle into something he could carry with him, because he knew it would not fade the way other moments had, it would stay, like a mark pressed into dry earth after the rain had gone, and the girl did not look back at first, not when she reached the line of riders, not when one of them handed her the reins of a waiting horse, she moved with the same quiet certainty she had held from the beginning, as if there had never been another path for her to take, and that steadiness said more than any farewell could have, and only when she placed her foot in the stirrup and paused for the briefest second did she turn her head, just enough to let her eyes find him one last time across the space that had once been filled with tension and now held something else entirely, something that did not need a name to exist, and Ethan did not raise a hand, did not step forward, he simply met that gaze and held it, steady as he had been from the moment he chose to stand, and in that silence there was no promise, no expectation, only recognition, and that was enough, and then she turned away, pulling herself into the saddle with a smooth motion that spoke of years spent learning the rhythm of movement and balance, and the line of riders began to shift, their formation adjusting without command, each man knowing his place without needing to be told, and the lead rider gave a final glance toward Ethan, not long, not heavy, just enough to acknowledge what had been done, and then he turned as well, guiding his horse with a slight movement of the reins, and the group moved as one, not hurried, not cautious, simply leaving in the same quiet way they had arrived, and the sound of hooves began to fade, not all at once, but gradually, like a memory slipping into the distance, and the land seemed to widen again as they went, the tension that had held everything in place loosening until it no longer pressed against the air, and behind Ethan the soldiers remained still for a moment longer, as if unsure how to move now that the shape of things had changed, and then one of them shifted, clearing his throat softly, the sound almost out of place after so much silence, and another adjusted in the saddle, the familiar rhythm of habit beginning to return. But it felt different now, less certain, less fixed, and the man who had given the orders earlier did not speak right away, his gaze following the retreating riders until they became nothing more than shapes against the horizon, and when he finally looked back at Ethan there was something in his eyes that had not been there before, not approval, not anger, but a kind of quiet questioning, as if he had seen something he could not fully explain, and Ethan met that look without defense, without challenge, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to prove, and after a moment the man gave a small shake of his head, more to himself than to anyone else, before turning back to his horse and reaching for the reins, and that was how it ended, not with a command, not with a resolution spoken aloud, but with a series of small movements that carried everyone back toward the paths they had come from, and Ethan remained where he was a little longer, long enough for the last trace of dust to settle, long enough for the sound of hooves to disappear completely, and when he finally moved it was not with urgency, not with hesitation, but with the quiet understanding that something had changed, not out there on the open land, not in the way the world would continue to turn without noticing, but inside him, in a place that would not return to what it had been before, and as he walked back toward his horse the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ground, stretching them thin until they blurred into one another, and for a moment it was hard to tell where one ended and another began, and maybe that was the truth of it, that the lines men drew were never as fixed as they believed, that sometimes all it took was one man choosing where to stand for those lines to shift, quiet as dust, steady as the wind, leaving behind something that could not be undone. The desert did not remember what had just happened, not in the way men did, it returned to itself almost immediately, the wind smoothing over the tracks, the light settling back into its slow, steady rhythm, as if nothing had ever disturbed it, but Ethan felt it still, not around him, not in the land, but in the quiet space inside his chest where something had shifted and refused to settle back the way it had before. And he walked to his horse without hurry, his boots pressing shallow prints into the dust that would not last past the next gust of wind. And for a moment he rested his hand on the worn leather saddle, feeling the familiar texture beneath his fingers, grounding himself in something simple, something known, because everything else felt just slightly out of place, not wrong, just different, and behind him the soldiers began to move at last, their voices low, not sharp or commanding the way they had been before, but quieter, measured, as if each man was choosing his words more carefully than usual, and no one mentioned what had happened directly, no one tried to reshape it into something easier to understand, because they could not, and that absence of explanation hung between them heavier than any argument ever could, and the man who had led them mounted his horse with a slow, practiced motion, his gaze drifting once more toward the horizon where the riders had disappeared, and then back to Ethan, and for a second it seemed as though he might speak, might try to reclaim the moment with words, but he did not, he simply gave a short nod, not approval, not dismissal, just acknowledgement that something had taken place beyond either of them, and then he turned his horse and started back the way they had come, the others following without question, because even when certainty cracked, habit still held, and Ethan watched them go only briefly before turning his attention elsewhere, because he understood that whatever had been decided out here did not belong to them anymore, it had already moved beyond their reach, and he swung into the saddle, the motion familiar, almost automatic, but the feeling behind it was not the same, and he guided his horse forward at a slow pace, not following the others immediately, not rushing to rejoin the line, because he needed a moment longer, just one, to sit with the silence that remained, and the land stretched wide around him, miles of dry earth and open sky that did not ask questions, did not offer answers, it simply existed, steady and indifferent, and that steadiness felt different now, less empty, as if it carried something unseen beneath its surface, and Ethan reached into his pocket without thinking, his fingers brushing against the small object he had carried for years without much thought, a piece of worn leather wrapped around a stone that matched the one he had seen at her neck, and he pulled it free slowly, holding it up against the fading light, watching the way it caught the sun just before it dipped lower, and the memory returned again, clearer this time, his mother's voice telling a story not of war or loss, but of a moment when someone had chosen not to turn away, When a stranger had become something else, not friend, not family, but something harder to name, and he had listened to that story as a boy without understanding it, without knowing that one day he would stand in a place where it mattered, and now it did, and he let out a slow breath, the kind that did not carry tension but release, and slipped the stone back into his pocket, not as a keepsake, but as a reminder, and when he finally turned his horse to follow the others, the sun had dropped low enough to cast long shadows across the ground, stretching everything thin, blending shapes together until it was hard to tell where one ended and another began, and maybe that was how it had always been, he thought, not separate lines but overlapping paths, crossing and receding without clear edges, and as he rode on, the sound of his horse's steps steady beneath him, the horizon wide and open ahead, he did not look back, not because he wanted to forget, but because he knew he would not. And out here that was enough, because some things did not need to be carried in your hands to stay with you, they stayed in the way you moved forward, quiet as the wind, certain as the land beneath your feet. The trail stretched ahead in a long, quiet line, worn by years of hooves and wheels and men who believed they knew exactly where they were going, and Ethan followed it now at an easy pace, not lagging behind but not pressing forward either, letting the rhythm of his horse settle into something steady beneath him, something that did not demand thought, and the sky above had begun to soften, the hard white of midday giving way to a deeper gold that rolled across the land in slow waves, touching the hills, the scattered brush, the distant ridges that stood like silent witnesses to everything that had passed and everything that would come, and for a while no one spoke, not because they had agreed to silence, but because there was nothing left that could be said without sounding smaller than the moment they had just left behind, and Ethan felt that silence differently now, not as emptiness, not as something to fill, but as something that carried weight of its own, something that allowed thoughts to settle without forcing them into words. And he found himself noticing things he might have missed before, the way the wind moved across the ground in faint ripples, the way the shadows stretched longer with every passing minute, the way the leather reins creaked softly in his hand with each step his horse took, small details that had always been there but had never seemed important until now, and ahead of him one of the younger riders glanced back briefly, his expression uncertain, as if trying to read something in Ethan that he could not quite understand, and Ethan did not meet his eyes directly, did not offer explanation or reassurance, because he knew there was nothing he could say that would make sense of it for someone else. Some things had to be seen, had to be felt in that exact moment when choice stood clear and unspoken, and anything less would turn it into something it was not, and the rider looked forward again, adjusting in the saddle, the movement slightly stiff, like a man trying to return to a shape that no longer fit quite the same, and the line continued on, steady but changed in a way that could not be measured in miles or time, and Ethan let his hand rest near his pocket again, not reaching for the small stone this time, but aware of it, aware of the quiet connection it held between what had been and what had just unfolded, and he wondered, not for the first time, how many stories moved through this land without ever being spoken aloud, how many choices had been made and forgotten by everyone except the ones who had stood there and lived them, and whether any of them had felt the same shift he carried now, the same quiet certainty that something inside had moved beyond its old boundaries, and as the trail curved gently around a low ridge, the light shifted again, catching the edges of the world in a way that made everything seem sharper for a brief moment before fading into the softer tones of evening, and Ethan slowed his horse slightly, just enough to let the distance between him and the others stretch by a few yards, not to separate himself, but to give himself space, because he understood now that what had happened out there was not something to leave behind quickly, it needed time to settle, to take its place among the things that shaped a man without ever announcing themselves, and he thought again of the girl, not in detail, not in memory of every word or movement, but in the way she had stood, the way she had looked at him without fear and without expectation, as if she had seen something in him that he had only just begun to recognize himself, and that thought did not weigh on him. It did not pull him backward, it simply stayed, quiet and steady, like a mark that did not fade with distance, and when the first star appeared faintly in the deepening sky, barely visible against the last light of the sun, Ethan noticed it without needing to look for it, and for a moment he followed its position as they rode, a fixed point above a land that never stopped shifting, and he understood then that not everything needed to be held on to remain true. Some things stayed simply because they had been real in the moment they mattered, and as the trail carried him forward into the cooling air of evening, the sound of hooves steady and unbroken. He did not try to define what had changed, he did not try to give it a name, because out here names did not make things real, choices did, and he had already made his, quiet as it had been, final as it would remain, and that was enough to carry him into whatever waited beyond the next bend in the trail. They made camp just as the last light slipped behind the ridge, not because anyone called for it, but because the land itself seemed to say it was time, the shadows stretching long and cool across the ground, the air losing its heat in slow, steady breaths, and the men moved through the familiar motions without needing instruction, dismounting, loosening straps, gathering what they needed for the night, each action practiced and quiet, as if speaking too much might disturb something that had followed them from the open desert, and Ethan worked alongside them without drawing attention, his hands steady as he removed the saddle and set it down, his horse shifting slightly before settling, the soft sound of leather and metal filling the space where voices might have been, and a small fire was built near the center of the camp, not large, not meant to draw eyes from miles away, just enough to hold back the darkness and give shape to the figures gathered around it, and as the flames caught and began to move, casting light that flickered across worn faces and weathered coats, Ethan found a place just outside the circle, close enough to feel the warmth but far enough to remain in the quiet he carried with him. And no one asked him to move closer, no one told him to leave, they simply let him be, and that, more than anything, told him how much had changed, because before this day there would have been words, questions, a need to place him back into the order of things, but now there was only silence, and in that silence there was a kind of respect that did not need to be named, and one of the younger men finally spoke, his voice low, uncertain, as if testing whether sound still belonged in this space, asking a question about the route they would take in the morning, and the leader answered in the same quiet tone, giving direction without force, and the conversation ended as quickly as it began, fading back into the steady crackle of the fire and the distant call of something moving beyond the edge of camp, and Ethan sat there for a while, his eyes on the flames but his thoughts somewhere else, not fixed on the past, not replaying every moment, but holding on to the feeling of it, the weight and the clarity that had come with standing still when everything else pushed forward, and he reached into his pocket again, pulling out the small stone wrapped in leather, turning it slowly between his fingers as the firelight caught its surface, and he realized then that it was not the object itself that mattered, not the story it carried from years ago, but the way it had found its place again, the way it had connected something distant to something immediate, and he closed his hand around it for a moment before slipping it back into his pocket, not needing to look at it any longer to understand what it meant. And across the fire the leader glanced at him once, not long, not searching, just enough to acknowledge his presence. And Ethan met that glance without hesitation, without lowering his eyes, and for a brief second there was an understanding there, quiet and unspoken, that whatever line had been crossed earlier had not broken anything essential, it had only revealed what had been there all along, and the night deepened around them, the stars beginning to fill the sky one by one, steady and distant, offering no answers but reminding anyone who looked up how small a single moment could seem against the stretch of time, and yet Ethan knew better now, knew that some moments carried more weight than years of silence, that a single choice could shape the way a man moved through everything that followed, and as he leaned back slightly, resting against his saddle, the warmth of the fire fading just enough to let the cool air settle in, he did not try to explain what had changed, did not try to give it shape or language, because out here those things were not necessary. What mattered was that when the time came, when the moment stood clear and quiet and unavoidable, he had not stepped aside, and that truth settled into him with a calm that did not need to be defended, and around him the camp grew still, one by one the men drifting into rest, their movements slowing, their voices fading completely, until only the fire remained, its light rising and falling in a rhythm as steady as breath, and Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to sit with the silence fully, to let it carry him forward without resistance, and in that quiet, under a sky that stretched farther than any road he had ever ridden, he understood something simple and final, that out here, where the land did not care what a man called himself, the only thing that remained was where he chose to stand, and once that choice was made, it did not need to be spoken again. The night passed without trouble, not because the land was empty, but because everything that moved within it seemed to keep its distance, as if even the unseen had felt the shift that had taken place and chose not to disturb it. And Ethan woke before the others, not from habit alone but from a rest that had settled deeper than sleep, his eyes opening to the faint gray light that stretched across the horizon just before dawn. And for a moment he did not move, listening instead to the quiet breathing of the camp, the soft shifting of horses, the low crackle of embers that had not fully died, and it all felt steady, grounded, the kind of stillness that came not from absence but from balance. And he sat up slowly, pulling his coat tighter against the cool air, and looked out across the open land, the shapes of distant hills barely visible in the early light. And he found himself thinking not of what lay ahead but of what had already passed, not replaying it, not questioning it, but simply acknowledging it, the way a man might acknowledge a landmark he had reached after a long ride, something that marked distance without needing to be explained. And as the first hint of sun touched the edge of the world, the colors began to shift, pale gray giving way to soft gold, the land waking in its own quiet way, and behind him one of the men stirred, then another, the camp returning to motion piece by piece. And no one spoke of the previous day, no one brought it back into words. But it remained there all the same, in the way they moved, in the way their voices stayed low, in the way their eyes avoided unnecessary questions. And the leader rose last, his movements slower than usual, as if carrying something that had not been there before. And when he finally stepped toward Ethan, it was not with authority, not with command, but with something closer to consideration. And he stopped a few feet away, looking out over the land rather than directly at him. And for a moment they stood there in silence, side by side but not facing each other. And then the man spoke, his voice quiet, steady. "There are lines out here," he said, not as instruction but as observation. And Ethan did not answer right away, because he understood the words without needing them to be explained. And after a moment he nodded once, not in agreement, not in disagreement, but in acknowledgement that the truth of it had always been there. And the man continued, "Most men spend their lives trying not to cross them," and there was no judgment in his tone, no approval or disapproval, just a statement of fact. And Ethan let out a slow breath, watching it fade into the cool air. And finally he spoke, his voice just as steady, "Some lines are not meant to hold," and that was all. And the man beside him did not respond immediately, his gaze still fixed on the horizon where the sun was now beginning to rise fully, casting light across the land in long, quiet strokes. And after a moment he gave a slight nod, almost to himself, before turning away, the conversation ending not with resolution but with understanding. And the camp began to move more fully then, men preparing to ride, gathering their things, tightening straps, the familiar rhythm returning but with a subtle difference, as if something had been adjusted that would not return to its original place. And Ethan moved with them, not apart, not separate, but not quite the same as before. And as he saddled his horse and prepared to ride on, he did not look for the past behind him, did not search the horizon for signs of what had been left there, because he knew that whatever had mattered had already settled where it needed to, not in the land, not in the distance, but within him. And as the group set out once more, the sun climbing higher, the trail stretching forward into another long day, Ethan rode with a quiet certainty that did not need to be proven, because out here, where words carried little weight and actions carried everything, he had already said enough by where he had chosen to stand, and that was something no distance could take away. The trail narrowed as the day stretched on, winding between low ridges and dry brush that whispered in the wind. And the sun climbed higher without mercy, casting sharp light across everything it touched, leaving no shadow deep enough to hide in. And the men rode in a quiet line, their horses steady beneath them, the rhythm of hooves blending into something constant, almost meditative. And Ethan kept his place among them, neither at the front nor falling behind, simply present, his posture relaxed but aware, his eyes moving across the land with a kind of attention that had changed, not searching for threats, not measuring distance, but noticing, truly noticing, the way the earth rose and fell, the faint tracks that crossed the trail and disappeared, the distant shapes that might have been rocks or something more. And he realized that for the first time in a long while he was not riding towards something he had been told to find, he was simply moving forward because that was what came next. And that difference settled into him with a quiet ease. And as the morning wore into midday, the heat pressed down harder, the air growing still, the horizon shimmering faintly in the distance. And one of the younger men shifted in his saddle, wiping his brow with the back of his hand, glancing toward Ethan again, not with confusion this time, but with something closer to curiosity, as if trying to understand how a man could stand the way he had and still ride on as though nothing had changed, and Ethan felt that look without turning, understanding that some questions did not need to be answered aloud. They simply waited until the moment came when they made sense on their own, and ahead the leader raised a hand slightly, signaling a brief halt near a shallow bend where a few scattered trees offered the only shade for miles, and the group slowed, dismounting without hurry, leading their horses to the thin shadow cast by the branches, and Ethan followed, resting his hand along the neck of his horse for a moment, feeling the steady warmth beneath his palm, grounding himself again in something simple, something real. And as the men gathered what little water they had, passing canteens without comment, the quiet remained, not heavy, not strained, just present, like the land itself, and Ethan took a small drink, letting the water sit for a moment before swallowing, the taste plain but welcome, and as he lowered the canteen his eyes drifted toward the horizon again, not searching, not expecting, but remembering, and for a brief second he thought he saw movement far off, a flicker against the light, something that might have been riders, or might have been nothing at all, and he did not point it out, did not speak, because he understood now that not everything needed to be brought into words to be real. Some things were meant to remain just beyond reach, present without demanding attention, and he turned back to the shade, settling against the trunk of a tree, the rough bark pressing lightly against his shoulder, and closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to let the stillness settle deeper, to carry the memory of that open desert moment without forcing it into shape, and when he opened them again, the world looked the same as it had before, the same dry land, the same quiet men, the same long trail ahead, and yet it was not the same, because he was not, and as the leader gave the signal to move on, the men mounted once more, the rhythm returning, steady and unbroken, and Ethan rode with them, the sun high above, the trail stretching forward, and somewhere in that quiet motion, in the space between what had been and what would come, he understood something simple and enduring, that a man did not always know when a moment would change him, but when it did not need to be marked, it revealed itself in the way he carried it forward, step by step, mile by mile, without needing to look back.